The dim, pulsating neon lights of Vashtaler created a haze that blurred the edges of the bustling city, but Cal Reiner navigated the chaos with ease. He was no stranger to the planet's dark underbelly. His entire life had been a series of calculated risks and narrow escapes. Tonight would be no different. Cal adjusted his tattered leather jacket as he ducked into a cantina teeming with danger and desperation. The air smelled of spilled alcohol, grease, and too many bodies packed into one place. A battered jukebox sputtered out an old alien tune, adding to the cacophony of murmurs, laughter, and the occasional shout. His boots scraped against the sticky floor as he headed toward the back, where a game of galactic poker was already underway. This wasn't just any game. It was his last chance. Cal's gaze drifted to his wrist, where a compact scanner sat disguised as a piece of worn tech. It had taken him months to modify the device, an illegal and highly sensitive piece of equipment that analyzed patterns in the holographic cards. It wasn't perfect, but it had saved his skin more than once. Tonight, he was betting everything on it. He approached the table with practiced confidence, his crooked grin already disarming the players. Seated there were three Brockhawks, hulking, tusked aliens whose sheer presence made the average human quake, and a jittery insectoid trader with twitching antennae. Brockhawks weren't known for their humor or patience, which made them particularly dangerous. Cal figured they'd lose interest in him as long as he didn't win too much too fast. Room for one more? Cal asked casually, leaning on the edge of the table. His voice was light, but his tone carried an undercurrent of challenge. One of the Brockhawks looked up, his yellow eyes narrowing. Buying Steep, human. Steep's my middle name. Cal dropped a pouch of credits onto the table with a clink that silenced the surrounding conversations. He slid into an open chair and gave the dealer, a sleek, insect-like AI drone, a curt nod. Deal me in. The cards shimmered as the AI shuffled and dealt. Each player hovered their hand over their cards, which projected holographic images readable only to them. Cal's scanner buzzed faintly, feeding him silent data on the table. He adjusted his strategy with each hand, playing just recklessly enough to blend in. The trader was the first to fold, his nervous energy unraveling under the Brockhawk's heavy stares. That left Cal against the trio of mercenaries. One Brockhawk growled as he pushed his chips forward, the motion causing the table to creak. Bold move, Cal said with a smirk. He mirrored the bet, raising it by a substantial amount. But let's see how far that courage goes. The game continued, each round tightening the noose around the room's collective tension. Cal's scanner hummed softly against his wrist, but he felt its strain. It wasn't meant for prolonged use, and the risks were mounting. By the final round, only Cal and the largest Brockhawk remained. The pot glowed on the table, a mix of credits, rare jewels, and a few priceless artifacts. But Cal had his eyes on one thing: his ship, the Iron Fong, which he'd been forced to wager after a particularly bad streak weeks ago. The Brockhawk snarled. You can't bluff your way out of this, human. Cal leaned back, feigning relaxation. Bluffing? Me? Never. He pushed his entire pile of chips forward. All in. A hush fell over the cantina. The Brockhawk hesitated, his massive fingers flexing as he considered the move. Cal's scanner confirmed his suspicion. The Brockhawk's hand was decent, but not unbeatable. He'd fold. With a low grunt, the alien slammed his cards onto the table, face down. Fold, he spat. Cal couldn't help but grin as he reached for the winnings. Better luck next time. But the Brockhawk wasn't done. As Cal pocketed his share, a heavy hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. The alien's tusks gleamed dangerously close to Cal's face. You cheated, the Brockhawk growled. No humans that lucky. Cal stayed calm, though his heart pounded. Cheating's a strong word. I prefer the adaptive strategy. The mercenary's grip tightened, and his two companions loomed closer. You've got 10 seconds to convince me not to snap you in half. Easy, Cal said, raising his hands. If you kill me, you'll never get your hands on my ship's tracker codes. The Iron Fong is worth a lot more alive than I am dead. The Brockhawk paused, his yellow eyes narrowing. It wasn't a perfect bluff, but desperation made it convincing. Finally, the mercenary shoved Cal back. Get out of here, human. If we see you again, you're dead. Cal didn't wait for a second warning. He bolted from the cantina, weaving through the crowded streets. His scanner buzzed angrily, the heat from its overuse stinging his wrist. He ignored it, focusing on reaching the docks. The Iron Fong came into view, an old but reliable freighter, its scarred hull a testament to the battles and smuggling runs it had endured. To Cal, it was more than a ship. It was freedom. It was home. He powered it up and blasted out of Vashtaler's atmosphere, leaving the neon sprawl behind. As the stars stretched into streaks of light, he allowed himself a shaky exhale. He'd made it. Barely. 2 jumps later, Cal found himself descending onto Yelinia Prime. The planet was a stark contrast to the chaos of Vashtaler. Rolling fields of blue grass shimmered under twin suns, and crystalline rivers carved elegant paths through the landscape. The air felt lighter here, untainted by pollution or conflict. But Kel wasn't here for the scenery. Yelinia Prime's strict peacekeeper laws made it the perfect place to lay low. He wandered through the capital, Lyrian, until a small sign caught his eye: room for rent. Quiet and clean. No questions asked. The door opened to reveal Zavara, her azure skin glowing faintly in the soft light. Her hair fell in silky waves, and her eyes, like molten silver, studied him with a quiet intensity. Behind her, a small girl peeked out, a child with the same blue complexion and wary gaze. "You need a place?" Zavara asked, her voice calm but firm. Cal nodded. "If the offer's still good." She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The house was modest but filled with warmth. Soft orbs of light floated near the ceiling, and intricate carvings adorned the walls. The child, Lyra, watched him with unblinking suspicion, clutching a small wooden toy. "No trouble," Zavara said, crossing her arms. "No weapons. No lies." Cal hesitated, then nodded. "Deal." As Zavara showed him to the spare room, Cal caught his reflection in a polished surface. For the first time in years, he didn't see a rogue or a cheat. He saw a man out of place, an outsider, but maybe, just maybe, a man looking for something more. The morning on Yelinia Prime was a far cry from the chaos Cal Reiner was used to. The twin suns rose lazily over the horizon, their warm light spilling through the gauzy curtains of Zavara's home and casting soft, golden patterns across the room. Outside, the hum of tranquil life filtered in, the low rustle of bluegrass swaying in the breeze, the distant calls of winged creatures gliding over crystalline rivers. For most, it would be idyllic. For Cal, it was unnervingly quiet. He sat on the edge of his cot, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. He hadn't slept much, his mind tangled in thoughts of escape routes, contingency plans, and the weight of the credits he had stashed in his jacket. He'd told himself he could lie low, keep his head down, and stay out of trouble. But trouble was a gravitational force in his life, and he always orbited too close. The faint clatter of dishes pulled him from his thoughts. He threw on his jacket and made his way into the kitchen. Zavara was there, as poised as ever, slicing a pale, translucent fruit with precision. Her azure skin shimmered faintly in the light, her movements calm and methodical. Lyra sat at the table, her small frame hunched over a bowl of porridge, her sharp eyes tracking Cal's every move. "Morning," Cal said, his voice gravelly. Zavara didn't look up from her work. "Morning." Lyra didn't respond. She simply scowled, her distrust of him as clear as the twin suns outside. Cal offered her a grin, but it only deepened her frown. He wasn't sure why he even tried. Zavara set a plate of fruit on the table and glanced at him. "There's water in the basin if you need to clean up." "Thanks," Cal muttered, splashing his face with cool water. It woke him up, but it did little to shake the weight pressing on his chest. He dried off with a cloth and turned back to the table, where Zavara was now sitting with her own plate. "You always look this serious in the morning?" he asked, trying to lighten the mood. Zavara raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Do you always ask questions you don't want answers to?" He chuckled. "Fair enough." But she wasn't done. "Do you always avoid telling the truth?" Cal froze for a moment, caught off guard. "What makes you think I'm lying?" Zavara leaned back slightly, her silver eyes sharp and discerning. You carry yourself like someone waiting for the ground to give way beneath your feet. People who stay here don't act like that. I'm just passing through, Cal said, trying to sound casual. Needed a quiet place to think, that's all. She studied him for a moment longer, then turned her attention to Lyra. Finish your breakfast. You have lessons soon. Lyra's glare flicked between her mother and Cal. She didn't speak, but the tension in her small shoulders was palpable. As she shoveled the last spoonful of porridge in her mouth, she slid off the chair and disappeared into the other room. She doesn't like me much, does she? Cal said. She doesn't trust you, Zavara replied. Neither do I. Harsh, he said with a mock wince. You let me stay, didn't you? For now, she said, her tone measured. But I don't make decisions lightly. If you bring trouble here, you're gone. Her words landed harder than he expected. Cal didn't reply. Instead, he grabbed a piece of fruit from the table and headed out the door. The market district of Lyrian was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, a bustling hub where vendors hawked goods from across the galaxy. Stalls overflowed with shimmering fabrics, glowing fruits, and intricate artifacts that seemed to defy physics. The air buzzed with the chatter of merchants and buyers, their voices mingling in a symphony of different languages. Cal moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his sharp eyes scanning the goods as much as the people. His hands twitched with the old instincts of a thief, but he restrained himself. He wasn't here to steal, at least not directly. He stopped at a stall selling Ilhani artifacts. The vendor, an older Ilhani man with deep blue skin and a knowing smile, nodded at him. You've got an eye for quality, the vendor said, gesturing to a ceremonial dagger displayed under a beam of light. Its translucent crystal blade glowed faintly, and the intricate carvings on its hilt told of its importance. That's not for tourists. I'm no tourist, Cal replied, leaning closer. The scanner embedded in his wrist buzzed faintly, mapping the artifact in precise detail. It was a masterpiece, and whoever bought it would never know if the one on their mantle was real or one of Cal's replicas. He lingered a moment longer before walking away, his scanner already uploading the data to a small device in his pocket. By the time he found a shadowy corner of the market, he had crafted a perfect replica of the dagger. With a practiced smile and a few well-placed words, he sold it to an eager collector for a tidy sum. It wasn't honest work, but it was clean enough to keep the peacekeepers off his back. At least for now. When Cal returned to Zavara's home that evening, the light inside was dim, and the air felt heavier. He stepped inside quietly, hoping to avoid notice, but Zavara was waiting. She sat at the table, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, pressing down on him like a weight. You're late, she said finally. Got caught up in town, he replied, slipping off his jacket. He tried to sound casual, but the tension in the room made it impossible. Doing what? She asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. Sightseeing, he said, avoiding her gaze. Her eyes flicked to the bulge in his jacket pocket, where the credits jingled faintly. Don't lie to me. Cal hesitated, then sighed. Fine. I made a few deals. Nothing illegal. Her gaze didn't waver. You're lying. Okay, maybe a little illegal, he admitted, but nothing dangerous. That's not the deal we made, Zavara said, her voice rising slightly. No trouble. No lies. If you can't follow that, you can leave. The words stung more than Cal wanted to admit. He opened his mouth to argue, but her next words stopped him cold. I don't care what you've done before, but I won't let you bring it here. Not near Lyra. He glanced away, guilt clawing at him. I'll keep it clean, he said quietly. I promise. Zavara studied him for a long moment before standing. You have one chance, Cal. Don't make me regret it. As she walked away, Cal slumped into a chair, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had promised himself he wouldn't get attached, but the look in Zavara's eyes and the trust she was barely willing to extend struck something deep in him. He couldn't afford to care, but he already did. The next morning, Lyra cornered him in the hallway. Her small frame vibrated with indignation, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I don't trust you, she said bluntly. Good, Cal replied, crouching to her level. You're smarter than most adults I know. She glared at him, unflinching. If you hurt my mom, I'll make you leave. Cal raised an eyebrow, impressed. You're tougher than you look, kid. Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she thrust her chin up defiantly and marched away, leaving Cal with a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know why, but her words stayed with him. For the first time in years, he felt like staying, and that scared him more than anything. The piece of Yelinia Prime shattered like glass. Cal Reiner woke to the unmistakable hum of a low-flying craft hovering far too close to Zavara's home. He shot upright, his senses sharpening instantly. The room was bathed in the cool hues of pre-dawn light, but the growing thrum outside drowned out the usual serenity of chirping birds and rustling bluegrass. He grabbed his boots, yanked them on, and peered out the window. What he saw sent a cold knot twisting in his gut. 3 Brakak mercenaries disembarked from a sleek black ship parked ominously near the edge of Zavara's property. Their towering forms moved with deliberate precision, tusked faces grim, weapons holstered but ready. The largest of the trio, the same one Cal had outwitted in Vashtaler, scanned the house with a predatory gleam in his yellow eyes. They had found him. Cal cursed under his breath and grabbed his jacket. His mind raced as he weighed his options. He could run, but the Bracocks would tear apart the house, and likely Zavara and Lyra looking for him. Fighting wasn't an option either. He was unarmed and outnumbered. That left only one choice: outthink them. He slipped into the hallway, moving quietly toward the kitchen. Zavara was already there, her expression tight with alarm. She held a carving knife in one hand, more for comfort than practicality. Lyra stood behind her, clutching her mother's robes and staring wide-eyed at Cal. "What's going on?" Zavara asked, her voice low but urgent. "Bracocks," Cal said, glancing toward the front door. "They're here for me." Zavara's grip on the knife tightened. "You brought them here?" "I didn't exactly send an invitation," he shot back, then softened his tone when he saw her glare. "Look, I can get them away from the house, but I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" Zavara's voice was sharp. "They're armed killers. My daughter is in this house. And I won't let anything happen to her," Cal said, meeting her gaze. "Or to you. But I need you to stay inside. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone until I come back." Zavara hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "You'd better keep your word." Cal knelt down to Lyra's level. "Hey kid, remember how you said you'd make me leave if I hurt your mom?" She nodded, her lips trembling. "Well, I'm not going anywhere. I'm gonna fix this. Just stay with her, all right?" Lyra didn't answer, but the faintest flicker of understanding crossed her face. Cal rose, steeling himself, and slipped out the back door. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp grass and earth. Cal skirted the edge of the property, keeping low as he circled toward the Bracocks. His pulse hammered in his ears, but his focus was razor-sharp. He spotted the mercenaries inspecting the house, their guttural voices carrying in the stillness. "You sure he's here?" one of them grunted. The leader growled. "Tracker doesn't lie. If he's not inside, he's nearby. We'll flush him out." Cal grimaced. Of course, they planted a tracker back on Vashtaler. He should have checked the Iron Fawn more thoroughly. Still, they were here now, and he had to act fast. He picked up a rock and hurled it into the bushes on the opposite side of the property. The sudden rustle drew the Bracocks' attention. "There!" barked the leader. The mercenaries moved toward the noise, weapons drawn. Cal slipped around behind them, his heart pounding. He spotted their ship, a sleek, angular craft with its ramp still lowered. An idea sparked in his mind, risky but doable. He crept onto the ramp, his steps silent against the metallic surface. The interior of the ship was cramped but functional, its walls lined with storage lockers and glowing control panels. He found what he was looking for near the cockpit: a set of emergency flares. He grabbed one and pocketed it, then turned his attention to the console. The Bracocks' navigation logs were open, displaying their flight path and a map of the surrounding area. Cal quickly accessed the ship's comm system and sent a distress signal on a random frequency. It wasn't much, but it might buy him some time. Footsteps echoed from outside. Cal froze, his breath hitching. One of the Brockhawks was heading back toward the ship. He ducked into the nearest storage compartment, pressing himself against the wall as the heavy boots thudded up the ramp. The mercenary muttered something in his guttural tongue, then moved toward the cockpit. Cal seized the opportunity, slipping out of his hiding spot and back down the ramp. He sprinted toward the cover of the trees, his mind racing. The Brockhawks regrouped near the house, their frustration evident. Still nothing, one of them growled. "He's close," the leader snarled. "Spread out. We'll find him." Cal gritted his teeth. He needed to draw them away, and he needed to do it now. He pulled the emergency flare from his pocket, ignited it, and hurled it high into the air. The bright, smoking streak cut through the sky, a glaring beacon impossible to miss. The mercenaries immediately turned toward the source. "There!" shouted the leader. They charged toward the flare, leaving the house behind. Cal ran parallel to them, staying just out of sight, leading them farther and farther into the dense bluegrass fields. His legs burned, but he pushed on, weaving through the tall stalks with practiced agility. Finally, he spotted what he'd been looking for, an abandoned irrigation ditch partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. He dove into it, landing hard but rolling to absorb the impact. The Brockhawks thundered past, their heavy footfalls receding into the distance. Cal allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, his body trembling with adrenaline. He couldn't stay hidden for long, but for now, he bought Zavara and Lyra some time. When Cal returned to the house hours later, the suns were high in the sky, their light casting sharp shadows across the landscape. He slipped inside through the back door, his body aching and his clothes streaked with dirt. Zavara was waiting in the kitchen, her expression unreadable. Lyra peeked out from behind her, her wide eyes scanning him for signs of injury. "You're all right," Zavara said, more a statement than a question. "Yeah," Cal said, sinking into a chair. "They're gone. For now." Zavara set the knife down on the counter and crossed her arms. "You're lucky they didn't come back." "I'm lucky for a lot of reasons," Cal said, meeting her gaze. "But this wasn't luck. It was me keeping my promise." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You did." Lyra stepped forward, hesitant but curious. "Did you fight them?" "Not exactly," Cal said, managing a small smile. "Let's just say I outsmarted them." The corners of her mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. Cal's chest tightened. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: belonging. But the Brockhawks weren't finished. He knew that much. And when they returned, he'd be ready. Because for Zavara and Lyra, he'd fight for more than survival. He'd fight for them. The days after the Brockhawk incident passed in uneasy quiet. Cal Reiner kept himself busy, working on small repairs around the house and tending to odd tasks Zavara assigned him. It felt strange, this pseudo-domesticity, but he embraced it as a distraction. For once, he wasn't running, and the stillness offered something he couldn't quite name. Yet, the tension lingered like an uninvited guest. He'd catch Zavara watching him out of the corner of her eye, her expression unreadable. Lyra, however, was less subtle. The little girl followed him everywhere, her wide silver eyes narrowing at his every move. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't the outright hostility she'd shown before. This particular morning, Cal found himself in the garden, crouched beside a malfunctioning irrigation unit. The intricate Ilhani design baffled him. It was a mess of tubes and glowing panels that didn't seem to connect in any logical way. He swore under his breath, earning a soft giggle from behind him. "Are you always this bad at fixing things?" Lyra asked, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed. Cal looked over his shoulder and smirked. "You always this good at criticizing?" Lyra shrugged. "I call it like I see it. Well, maybe you'd like to show me how it's done, genius." To his surprise, Lyra didn't hesitate. She marched over, knelt beside him, and began fiddling with the unit. Her small hands moved with surprising confidence as she adjusted the settings on the glowing panel. Within moments, the system hummed to life, water trickling steadily into the garden beds. Cal stared at her, dumbfounded. "How did you—" "Mom taught me," Lyra said, brushing dirt off her knees. "She says I'm a fast learner." "No kidding," Cal muttered, genuinely impressed. Guess I'll just hire you as my personal engineer. Lyra gave him a look that was half smirk, half suspicion. You couldn't afford me. Before Cal could respond, Zavara appeared at the edge of the garden, her hands full of freshly picked fruits. She paused, taking in the sight of Lyra and Cal crouched together by the irrigation unit. Her expression softened, though she quickly masked it as she approached. I see Lyra's putting you to shame, Zavara said, setting the fruits down on a nearby table. Completely, Cal admitted, rising to his feet. I think she just saved your entire garden. Zavara raised an eyebrow at Lyra. And you didn't even charge him? You're slipping. Lyra's giggle turned into a full laugh, and Cal found himself smiling despite the ever-present unease in his chest. As the day wore on, Cal found himself falling into an easy rhythm with the two of them. It was a strange feeling, this tentative camaraderie. They worked together in the garden, cooked a simple meal in the kitchen, and even shared a quiet moment on the porch as the suns began to set. But as night fell, the serenity began to fray. Cal sat alone in the common room, the faint hum of the house's power systems filling the silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Brockhawks weren't done with him. They were relentless, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they tracked him down again. The thought made his stomach churn. He had brought this danger into Zavara and Lyra's lives, and the guilt was eating away at him. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear Zavara approach. You're restless, she said, her voice soft but firm. Cal looked up startled. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette outlined by the dim light from the hallway. Her silver eyes searched his face, and for once, he didn't try to hide his unease. They'll come back, he said simply. You know that, right? Zavara stepped into the room and sat across from him. I know. And you're still letting me stay? You've proven you'll fight for us, she said. That's more than most would do. Cal shook his head. You don't know me, Zavara. Not really. I'm not some noble hero. I'm just a guy trying to survive. Surviving and protecting aren't mutually exclusive, she said, her tone unwavering. You don't have to be perfect to do what's right. Her words struck something deep in him, a part of himself he'd buried long ago. He wanted to argue, to push back against the faith she seemed to have in him, but he couldn't. Instead, he nodded, the weight of her gaze forcing him to confront a truth he wasn't ready to admit. The next morning, Cal found himself wandering into Lyrian's market district. He wasn't looking for trouble, just supplies, but trouble had a way of finding him. As he browsed a stall selling mechanical parts, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Brockhawks are still on planet, a merchant whispered to his colleague. Saw their ship parked near the western cliffs. Cal froze, his hand hovering over a bundle of wiring. His mind raced. The Brockhawks hadn't left after all. If they were still searching for him, it was only a matter of time before they found Zavara's house again. He needed a plan. By the time Cal returned, the suns were beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Zavara was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Lyra sat at the table, scribbling on a piece of paper with a stylus. I need to talk to you, Cal said, his voice low but urgent. Zavara looked up, her expression immediately alert. What is it? They're still here, he said. The Brockhawks. They're parked near the western cliffs. Zavara's jaw tightened, but she didn't panic. What do you plan to do? I'm going to lead them away, Cal said. For good this time. Lyra looked up from her drawing, her eyes wide with fear. But what if they hurt you? They won't, Cal said, forcing a reassuring smile. I've got a plan, and I'm good at plans. Zavara crossed her arms, her silver eyes boring into his. You can't just throw yourself into danger without a backup. What if they capture you? Or worse? They won't, Cal said again. I've got something they want. Zavara hesitated, then nodded. Just be careful. Lyra stood and walked over to him, clutching something in her small hands. She held it out, a simple wooden carving of a bird. For luck, she said quietly. Cal took it, his throat tightening. Thanks, kid. I'll need it. As he stepped out into the night, the carving tucked safely into his pocket, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the weight of people depending on him. It terrified him, but it also gave him purpose. And this time, he wouldn't run. The cold air of Yelinia Prime carried a sharpness that stung Cal's lungs as he stood at the edge of the bluegrass fields. The vast expanse before him swayed gently in the moonlight, its serenity a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in his mind. He tightened his grip on the small wooden carving Lyra had given him, the edges pressing into his palm as though grounding him to the moment. He had promised Savara and Lyra he would protect them. Now, he had to make good on that promise, no matter the cost. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, piecing together a plan that felt more desperate than foolproof. The Brockhawks were relentless, their cruelty matched only by their determination. Cal had sabotaged their ship, but he knew it was a temporary fix. They would find a way to repair it or call for reinforcements. Either way, they would come back for him, and if they couldn't find him, they would take their vengeance out on Zavara and Lyra. He couldn't let that happen. His feet moved before his mind fully caught up, carrying him across the open field toward the cliffs where the Brockhawks had stationed their ship. The bluegrass brushed against his legs, whispering with each step. The twin moons hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced as he moved. He kept his body low, sticking to the shadows of the taller vegetation. The Brockhawk ship came into view, its sleek, predatory shape illuminated by faint blue lights emanating from its hull. The ramp was lowered, and two mercenaries stood guard, their hulking forms silhouetted against the glow. Their massive tusks caught the light as they conversed in low, guttural tones. Cal crouched behind a cluster of rocks, his heart pounding as he observed their movements. He needed to draw them away from the ship. His mind raced through the possibilities, each one more reckless than the last. He pulled a small, circular device from his pocket, a makeshift decoy he had cobbled together from spare parts. It wasn't fancy, but it would do the job. He activated it, and it emitted a faint, rhythmic beeping before he tossed it into the tall grass a few meters away. The sound caught the mercenaries' attention immediately. One of them grunted, motioning toward the noise with his blaster. The other nodded, and they moved cautiously toward the source, their weapons raised. Cal waited until they were fully distracted before slipping out of his hiding spot and making his way to the ramp. The interior of the ship was colder than the night outside, its metallic walls gleaming faintly under the pale blue emergency lights. Cal moved quickly but silently, his boots making only the faintest sound against the floor. His first stop was the engine room. He needed to ensure the ship stayed grounded, no matter what repairs the Brockhawks attempted. The engine room pulsed with a low, ominous hum, the ship's power core glowing like a malevolent heart. Cal approached the control panel, his fingers moving deftly across the unfamiliar interface. He didn't need to understand the alien technology completely, just enough to disable it. He found what he was looking for, the override system. With a few quick inputs, he shut down the power core and locked it with a passcode only he could unlock. The lights in the room flickered, and the hum faded into silence. Cal allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, but it was short-lived. A low growl echoed from the doorway, freezing him in place. He turned slowly to see the Brockhawk leader standing there, his tusks gleaming and his yellow eyes burning with fury. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" The leader snarled, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the walls. Cal raised his hands, trying to buy time. "What can I say? I'm persistent." The leader charged before Cal could react, his massive form slamming into him like a freight train. Cal hit the wall hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He ducked just as the Brockhawk swung a meaty fist, the blow denting the wall where his head had been. Cal rolled to the side, grabbing a wrench from a nearby workstation and swinging it with all his strength. The metallic clang echoed through the room as the wrench struck the Brockhawk's arm, but it barely fazed him. The Brockhawk grabbed Cal by the collar, lifting him off the ground as though he weighed nothing. "You think you can stop us?" the alien growled, his hot breath washing over Cal's face. "You're nothing but a pest." Cal's hand scrambled in his pocket, finding the wooden carving. Desperation and adrenaline fueled him as he jammed it into the Brockhawk's face, striking his eye. The alien roared in pain, dropping Cal and staggering back. Cal didn't waste the opportunity. He bolted from the engine room, his legs burning as he sprinted down the corridor. He emerged onto the ship's ramp, the cool night air a welcome relief against his flushed skin. The two guards from earlier had returned, their weapons drawn as they spotted him. Cal cursed under his breath, scanning the area for an escape route. His eyes fell on a pile of supply crates stacked near the edge of the cliffs. The Brockhawks opened fire, their energy blasts scorching the air around him as he dove behind the crates. He could feel the heat of the shots grazing past him, the smell of burnt grass filling his nostrils. He needed to think fast. His hand found a small metallic cylinder among the crates, a flare. He activated it, the bright red light casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. Cal stood, hurling the flare toward the Brockhawks before sprinting toward the edge of the cliffs. The mercenaries hesitated, momentarily blinded by the light, giving Cal the seconds he needed. He skidded to a halt at the cliff's edge, the sound of crashing waves far below filling his ears. He turned to face his pursuers, his chest heaving as he raised his hands. "You want me?" he shouted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Come and get me." The Brockhack leader appeared at the top of the ramp, his bloodied face twisted with rage. He barked an order, and the guards moved closer, their weapons trained on Cal. But before they could reach him, the ship behind them sputtered and sparked, its disabled engines emitting a high-pitched whine. The lights flickered, and smoke began to pour from the hull. Cal grinned. "Looks like you're grounded." The leader roared in frustration, but he didn't advance. The ship's condition was too precarious, and Cal had positioned himself in the one place they couldn't easily reach. After a tense standoff, the leader snarled, motioning for his men to retreat. "This isn't over, Reiner," he growled before disappearing into the smoky interior of the ship. Cal stood there for a moment, the tension leaving his body in a rush. He turned, staring out at the horizon as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds. The waves crashed below, their steady rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. When he finally returned to Zavara's home, the suns were rising, casting warm light across the bluegrass fields. Zavara met him at the door, her silver eyes scanning him for injuries. Lyra peeked out from behind her, her small face lighting up with relief when she saw him. "You're back," Zavara said softly, her voice filled with equal parts relief and reprimand. "I told you I'd handle it," Cal said, managing a tired smile. Lyra ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I knew you would." Cal knelt, placing a hand on her head. "I couldn't let you down, could I?" Zavara stepped closer, her gaze softening. "You could have died, but I didn't," he said, meeting her eyes. "And I'd do it all again." For the first time, Zavara smiled, a small but genuine expression that sent a warmth through Cal's chest. He was bruised, battered, and utterly exhausted, but as he looked at the two of them, he realized it was worth every risk. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting for something real. The mornings on Yelenia Prime carried a strange kind of peace, the kind Cal Reiner had long forgotten. The golden light of the twin suns spilled across the bluegrass fields, casting the house in a warm glow. Cal stood by the garden, a cup of strong, bitter Yelenian brew in his hand, watching Lyra tinker with one of her mechanical birds. The small creation flapped its wings with a soft whir, catching the sunlight as it hovered a few feet above her outstretched hand. "You've got a real knack for this stuff, kid," Cal said, leaning against the wooden railing of the porch. His voice carried a lightness that felt unusual even to him. Lyra grinned. "Mom says I get it from my dad." The words hit Cal harder than he expected, but he kept his expression neutral. "Sounds like your dad was a smart guy." "He was," Lyra said, glancing up at him, her silver eyes bright. "And brave, too. Mom says he'd do anything to protect us." Cal's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of Zavara's voice called them both inside for breakfast. The meal was simple: fresh fruits from the garden and a warm loaf of dense, spiced bread that Zavara had baked. Lyra chattered excitedly about her next project, a mechanical bird that could record sounds and play them back. Zavara listened with a quiet smile, occasionally offering suggestions. Cal, for once, simply observed, The ease between them was something he had rarely seen, let alone felt. It was a rhythm, a connection he hadn't realized he missed. "You're quiet this morning," Zavara said, breaking into his thoughts. "Just thinking," Cal replied, tearing off a piece of bread. "Dangerous habit for you," she teased, her tone light but knowing. Cal smirked but didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Lyra. "Hey, what do you think about working on something for the Iron Fong next? She could use a little help." Lyra's eyes widened with excitement. "Really?" "Sure," Cal said. "If your mom's okay with it." Zavara arched an eyebrow. "As long as you're not turning my daughter into a full-time mechanic." "Only part-time," Cal quipped, earning a laugh from Lyra. Later that day, Cal found himself back at the Iron Fong, the ship's shadow stretching long across the hangar floor. He ran his hand along the weathered hull, the scars of past battles etched into the metal like a history he couldn't escape. The ship had been his refuge for years, his only constant in a galaxy that had never shown him mercy. But now it felt distant, like a relic of a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. "You're always drawn back to this ship." The sound of Zavara's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood at the edge of the hangar, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "It's familiar," Cal said, turning to face her. "That's all." "Familiar doesn't always mean safe," Zavara replied, stepping closer. "All right?" Cal leaned against the ship, his hands resting on the worn metal. "This ship's been my whole life, Zavara. It's all I've ever known." "And now?" she asked softly. Cal hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Now it feels empty." Zavara studied him for a long moment, her silver eyes searching his face. "Cal, why are you really here? Why did you come to Yelinia Prime?" "I told you," Cal began, but Zavara cut him off with a quiet shake of her head. "You didn't just come here to hide. You came because you had nowhere else to go. And yet, you stayed." Cal sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I stayed because of you. Because of Lyra." Zavara's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "Because we're your family." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken until now. Cal's chest tightened, a thousand emotions warring within him. He looked at her, at the woman who had taken him in despite every reason not to, and the truth finally broke free. "I never meant to leave," Cal said, his voice raw. "Back then I thought I was doing the right thing. Keeping you safe. Keeping Lyra safe. But I was wrong." Zavara's eyes glistened, but she held his gaze. "You're here now, and I'm not going anywhere," Cal said, stepping closer. "Not again." Zavara nodded, her expression a mix of relief and something deeper. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Then stay. Not for guilt or redemption. Just stay." That evening, the three of them sat together in the garden, the twilight painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. Lyra had her mechanical bird in her lap, fine-tuning the solar wings. Zavara sat beside Cal, her presence steady and calming. The warmth between them felt unspoken, but undeniable. As the stars began to emerge, Lyra suddenly spoke. "Cal, can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Are you my dad?" The question hit him like a tidal wave, but there was no fear in her voice, only curiosity. Cal glanced at Zavara, who gave him a small nod. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Yes," Cal said finally. "I am." Lyra stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. "I knew it." Cal blinked, caught off guard. "You did?" Lyra nodded. "Mom said you were brave. And you are. But you're also kind. Like her." Zavara smiled, her hand brushing lightly against Cal's. "She's smarter than both of us combined." Cal laughed, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. He looked at Lyra, his daughter, and for the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. As the night deepened, the three of them sat beneath the stars, the warmth of their connection stronger than anything Cal had ever known. This was his family, and he would fight for them, always.